Chapter 5. Fragments. Word flashed through town that a convict had escaped from one of the nearby penitentiaries. Some insisted that he was holding up somewhere in Paris. It was the greatest excitement of the week, as housewives gathered over one afternoon tea and their husband elbowed up to the town bar to discuss the most titillating news that had cropped up in months. And every tiny sound in the night simply had to be the con. I lay awake between my brothers, trying to get comfortable, trying to sleep, if only for the lack of anything else to do with myself. Suddenly, I heard a loud knock outside, and we all jumped. I could hear my mother speaking to the old man. She'd heard a sound in the backyard. The terrible truth suddenly flashed through all of our minds. The con was on our property. There was little hesitation on Cyrus's part. He was too vicious to lie in bed waiting for someone to sneak in and attack him. He bolted out of bed and charged down the steps. As soon as he was out of earshot, we all tumbled out of the rickety bed and squeezed around the window. I pressed my face against the dusty glass to get the best possible view of the action. From our upstairs perch, we could look down and see the dark figure of the old man charging out of the house, his fist closed and ready to hammer his victim to a pulp. I thought about the poor escaped convict, and I felt sorry for him. If the old man ever caught him, I could imagine on the con fleeing in panic, welts and bruises and cuts all over his body. In my mind's eye, I saw him running headlong back to the detention center, banging wildly on the front door, pleading hysterically for the warden to let him back in, promising never to escape again after meeting that monster in Paris. We found out later that the con was captured miles away. He had never come to Paris at all. But unlike the imaginary convict, I had no prison to prefer. There was no escape, suspended in the limbo between unwantedness and deprivation. I found no resource but the hateful, tempestuous old man who served as its hub. There were no options, no source of dinner, but the sporadic source I had always known. No other source of shelter, but the house I was sometimes able to sleep in. In the winters, when I found myself outside instead of inside on a cold, windy evening, I leaned against the house and let the tears freeze on my blotchy face. I had no evidence of my own badness except for the constant indictment of the old man's vulgar threats. I did not know why I was so despicable, and in my helpless state as a bewildered, anxious child, I cried out to the vague image of an overseer, who I would desperately hope would hear me someday: God. The local Pentecostal church had welcomed us to their gospel cadet meetings, even though we were preceded by our smell and followed by our filth. The church was only a short walk from the house, just up around the corner. And perhaps because they found themselves in the same unfortunate neighborhood as we, they welcomed us on Friday nights. It was a madhouse, with games of all kinds to drain the energy out of the dozens of street kids who assembled there. Then Bible stories and choruses. The leaders, all nameless to me, seemingly identical in their scrubbed cleanness, were kind and patient, knowing, I always thought, what was going on back there in the Wick House. And I heard them talk about God. I had no reason to believe it was a lie. I never saw him, and really heard no explanation for the phenomenon. So I never considered meeting him, never thought about establishing a personal relationship. But they talked to him, and they said he could help people when they had problems. And so my primitive prayer life was established. Leaning on the south wall of the house to avoid the worst of the winter wind, with the peeling paint scraping off onto my threadbare shirt, I cried and I called out to God. I felt overwhelmed and hopeless nevertheless. Mom had moments of genuine concern about our salvation, but the brave, bold lady evangelist, Amy, of the years before, had vanished, replaced by a confused and fearful woman. Once in a while she herded us to the Pentecostal Sunday school. We attended without shoes rather than wear the rags we owned, but our attendance was sporadic at best. Occasionally she gathered us around her and told us a Bible story, but there was no clear-cut evangelism. She was a masterful storyteller, capturing our attention with her wide eyes and expressive voice. In those magic moments, we were transported to another world, another life, and introduced to the strange and mystery-draped characters of the past. Ironically, I was most fascinated by the story of two women who asked King Solomon to settle the dispute over who had mothered the surviving baby between them. Pretending to be equitable, the wise monarch ordered that the child be cut in half and shared equally by the two women. But the real mother in her love, according to Solomon's good gamble, preferred to give up the child rather than see it senselessly destroyed. Although I had no way of knowing it yet, my mother had made the opposite decision. Unable to part with her infant, she had chosen instead, by default, my virtual destruction. I was the child in dispute, being torn in two. Cyrus was the sword. There was no wise Solomon to make the best decision, nor in fact any decision at all. Mum's sporadic storytelling sessions accomplished no change, produced no hope for the fragmented family. Even as I acquired my own first New Testament, when the Gideons came to school to make their usual presentation, the event was more marked by humiliation than by hope. The Gideons had carefully engraved the name of each student on this personalized, pocket-sized testament. As the organization's representative called out the names, one by one, my schoolmates marched to the front to claim their prizes. I felt my heart beating a little faster as the A's were dispensed with and the B's began. Then I heard the terrible mistake. "Mary Blair, the man calls?" I was horrified. The class exploded with laughter and catcalls. "It's Maury Blair," I corrected him lamely, my face burning with shame. The rest of the class carried their New Testaments home with them at the end of the school day. I went home empty-handed, to face the hell the old man would once again bring with him. Days later, my corrected New Testament would be handed to me privately after school. I rarely read it, and failed to understand the stuffy King James dialect when I read it. Not till years later would its impact be felt in my life. People were concerned. People were praying for me, but I never knew. The leaders of the gospel cadets, suspecting some of the turmoil in our home, were praying for all of us. People driving by our house or driving by as we hitchhiked from place to place with our mother prayed for us through the years, but seldom stopped to help. Across the river from our house stood a mill. The workers watched us on the brakes as we cavorted in our steep backyard, riding the flimsy fence at the edge of our little yard, threatening every moment to go tumbling down the ridge into the river, or tobogganing down the ridge on the scraps of cardboard. Some literally watched us grow up on the riverbank and wondered how we ever survived. During moments of relief, on long summer days when school was out and Cyrus was safely cloistered in someone's house with his plastering business, the rigid fear exploded free and took form in wild play. We played frenetic hockey with a tennis ball in the front yard. Our property became the neighborhood boxing ring or baseball diamond. We brought mounds of dry leaves from the neighbor's yard and dumped them in our yard to play in. "We don't have trees on our property," he fumed. "Look at that mess." My brothers and I excelled in neighborhood terrorism. Next door, the notorious Mrs. Dudley became a favorite target. We climbed her trees against her wishes, knocked out her windows playing baseball, and kept her generally aggravated. Beyond Mrs. Dudley's place was the Michaels' residence, also a favorite playground where our mischief was commonly rewarded by an angry Mrs. Michaels stomping up to her front porch, wagging her finger in consternation. Across the street were the Hartmans, whose daughter Donna inspired us to rock throwing and other guerrilla tactics. Maury's old grandma lived down the street. She sat on her veranda and resolutely ignored us as our rock missiles bounced all around her. We called her the Old Hen. Years later, I would learn from a relative of hers that she had prayed for me fervently and faithfully in spite of the harassment. And the ridge over the river bank was the perfect castle wall. When anyone plunked down to do some fishing, we showered them with rocks. At least one mother in our street warned her children, "If I ever catch you talking to any of those wicks, I'll will the tar out of you." There were dangers in our wild kingdom, however. I located a group of burly workmen constructing a veranda, and I found a perch above them from which I could bounce rocks off their hard hats. One of the men, irritated, stabbed his shovel into a mound of soft earth and hurled it at me. At the same moment, his glove slipped off his sweaty hands, and the entire shovel shelled up to me. I had no time to dodge the blade. It smashed into my forehead and split the flesh. I tumbled off the perch and instinctively scrambled away, blood flooding down my face. I came to the door of my house, breathless, and then realized the trouble I would get into if I bled in the house. I could imagine Cyrus grabbing me and pounding me, shouting curses, if I bled on the floor. Dizzy and desperate, I knocked on the door, then backed down to the ridge, kneeling with my bleeding wound held well out over the ridge. Mother came to the door and reacted with alarm. She led me to the kitchen sink and began to wash the blood away, only to find the bleeding had not slowed. "Oh, Cy," she called nervously into the living room. "I can't get the blood to stop." Cyrus sneered. "Ah, let him bleed to death." Mother wrapped my head in a towel and hurried me to a doctor who administered the necessary stitches. Whenever Mom was not at home, it was usually to visit her sisters in Flint. Invariably, she took my brothers, Mark and Cyrus, with her, leaving me behind, terrified. It was the most painful rejection of all. But Mark and Cyrus were younger, and she did not trust the old man to take care of them. I sat in my bedroom for hours, looking longingly beyond my favorite tree and toward the train as it took my mother and brothers away. Inside, the emptiness ate me alive. But during Mom's absences, the strange metamorphosis never failed to take place. Cyrus never hit me when she was gone. Why expend the energy when hurting Alice was the whole point? The abuse, though, was always just as vicious as ever. When Mom left money with my oldest sister Rose to take us to the circus, as it came to town, Cyrus intervened. "You're not taking that black bastard anywhere," he told her. "I am, Uncle Cy," Rose pouted. "Mom left enough money for me to take him." Cyrus grew madder by the moment as Rose held her ground. I listened to the unfolding drama from my place next to the floor vent upstairs, my stomach tight with tension and hope, until finally Cyrus grew tired of the sparing and settled for hateful acquiescence. "All right," he growled. "Take the black bastard and throw him over the bridge on the way home." There were desperate, futile attempts at manliness. The vines down at the end were submerged into the spring, but as the river ran shallower in the summertime, the slender cane weeds were exposed to the hot sun. I found that I could break off a dried cane and light one end, and it would glow like a cigarette, while I sucked on the other end. But the manly experience took its toll. I smoked the cane down completely and spent the entire next day vomiting up my nausea. By the 5th grade, I had graduated to stolen cigarettes, which I carefully hid from my mother and my older sister, Rose. When I ripped my coat and asked Rose to mend it, she smelt the telltale odor. "I smell cigarette smoke," she said with a frown as she sewed. "Really?" I asked in my best nonchalant voice. "Maury, have you been smoking?" she quizzed me suspiciously. I pretended to be aghast at the very suggestion. "Who, me? Nah, not me." There were occasional triumphs. I found I could play a good game of softball, and I became captain of one of the school teams. We called ourselves the Indians, and my brother Frank made us colorful cardboard armbands to declare it. But baseball in the street was too lowly, too common to afford true heroism on a continuous basis. For all the thrills of playing well and winning, my ground-level perspective on life kept me from feeling fabulous about it. Only once did the sport elevate me to the heights of giddy self-fulfillment. Bases were loaded with 2 outs. I came up to bat and something magically charged me. I deliberately let the first 2 strikes zip by me. Then, in a brash gesture, completely beyond the realm of my puppy-whipped character, I pointed boldly toward the deep center field, Babe Ruth style. The kids of both teams laughed and booed and hooted at me, but I was resolute. The pitch came. I threw myself into the swing, and the softball rocketed up and out and over the far edge of the center field. For a brief moment, there was a stunned silence. Then my teammates cried out in complete mania, whooping and cheering, exploding with the gleeful surprise of the impossible beautifully accomplished. As I trotted around the bases following my 3 teammates, I felt the flush of sheer single-handed victory. It was such a rare high, though, that I hardly knew what to do with it. And there was always the old man to bring me back down once I reached the house. If softball provided any emotional cushion to life, the classroom punctured it. I had no security blanket at home, and the thought of going to school terrified me from the beginning. I could not conceptualize it, a place of fun, or freedom, or fearlessness, because from the point of my earliest memory I had known none of these. With exceeding terror and nausea, I approached the 1st grade, my mind full of dark images, a huge brick building with a clone of Cyrus at the chalkboard and every classroom snarling and snapping. Once the initial adjustment was made, however, I found that the schoolroom could be a source of more attention than I had ever received in my short, unhappy life. I learned quickly enough that the kids around me giggled and approved of me when I deliberately botched up my schoolwork. The teacher saw through the ruse and strapped me soundly. I quit going for the laughs and withdrew into a lonely shell, unable to make friends by any other means. One day when the upper grades had vacation because of teachers' conferences, I walked to school downcast. My older brothers, Frankie and Jay, passed me in the back of a pickup truck, hitchhiking a free ride just for the fun of it, and I felt myself wanting to cry in my loneliness. The loneliness festered hostility within me. 2 colleagues and I had been run out of class and determined to gain recognition by sneaking back into the classroom and startling the old teacher. As we crept up the aisle, she looked up suddenly and jumped up with fright. We squealed in laughter. She grabbed me by the arm and shook me violently. Instantly, I lashed out at her. "Get your filthy hands off me," I spat. And I broke away and ran full tilt for the stairway. As I raced down the stairs, I came face to face with the principal, staring me down for my speeding violation. I turned back to go back up the stairs and found myself cut off by the infuriated teacher looking down at me from above. Panicky, I clutched my stomach and screamed, "I'm sick!" and fled past the principal and out of the building. When I got home, my mother dutifully made me return to school. Soon I was sheepishly facing the teacher again, expecting to be whipped severely. But the punishment was miraculously spared. "Maury, I could give you the strap for this," she offered, quietly, "but it wouldn't help. And I know you're having a difficult time at home." It was an embarrassing way to let me off the hook, almost worse than getting the strap, for it told me she knew the grueling humiliation and mental torture I was being subject to. It made me all the more distant and withdrawn to think that the people in town could see through the terrible truth. I was a rat, trapped in my own house. But it was evident the terrible truth had always a way of poking through. I ran down a stairway into the school building and tripped, falling headlong into a brick wall. I was knocked unconscious. As I awoke from the haze with the teachers and students huddled all around me, I instinctively covered my face with my arms, kicking and fighting to escape. "What's wrong with you, Maury?" they asked as they tried to calm me. Suddenly I realized that Cyrus was not beating me. I had no answer for their puzzled questions. Escape was a constant challenge. There were dozens of trivial, unrelated efforts. I found washers in the gutter and wore them like treasured rings. Marbles recovered from sewer holes became prized possessions. I admired a boy named Terry who lived down the street, the son of the old hen, one of our favorite neighborhood targets at rock throwing times. Terry enjoyed wildflowers, and I ambitiously pursued the same interests for the summer. I found a plot of suitable earth beyond the fence on the ridge behind the house where Cyrus was least likely to look. There I planted an assortment of wildflowers, collected from various exotic locations all over town, from alleys to the rich people's gardens. Like the single-minded gardener stereotype, I lost myself for hours in the pitiful little garden, huddled over my watering and puttering, as if mine were the competition-bound blooms of the finest varieties. With excited patience, I sat still long enough on the back steps to get the robins to take scraps of bread from the ground right in front of my feet. And I made friends with the field mouse, feeding him scraps of food and taming him sufficiently to have him running up and down my arms and in and out of my tattered pockets. I kept him in a makeshift cage near the garden, until one day a heat wave rolled through Ontario, and the tiny prisoner died of thirst. A lump forced its way up into my throat as I looked down at the stiff little animal, but I could not let myself cry. Summers had another peculiar tragedy. Cyrus was inclined to take off from work early on summer days, headed for the tavern in the hotel, and become ferociously inebriated. His erratic schedule made it more difficult for me to gauge his frame of mind. Sometimes I failed to post myself in my hiding places if he headed home ahead of schedule, and often he caught me downstairs, the ultimate taboo, which guaranteed more hideous cursing and more vehement beatings. The tension seemed to swell with seasonal changes. Summer slivered things in our house until on many occasions my mother farmed me out to trusted neighbors for a day or two at a time, to let things cool off, to assuage Cyrus's vicious fury. There were not many neighbors inclined to take in such a rank little ragamuffin, but folks from across the Pentecostal church could be relied on to treat me well if they could be persuaded to take me at all. The separation from familiar, in spite of the horrors of home, disturbed me. I never felt at ease in anyone else's home. One night my mother installed me in the house across the street. I lay in the prescribed bed alone, a luxury of sorts, except that I was nervous and fidgety. The foreign atmosphere, the relative cleanliness, perhaps, or maybe just the suggestions of unwantedness that the whole thing represented, kept me awake and troubled. And then I heard the sound of a mouse gnawing under the bed. My pet must have given me no great love of wild mice, particularly one gnawing uninvited under me in the middle of the night. The man of the house stopped by my room to check on me and found me out of bed, dressing. "What are you doing?" he asked, a little startled. "I'm going home," I replied with determination. "I'll take my chances." He tried to talk me out of the decision, but I could not stay there. I was too flighty, too disturbed, too settled in, even for one night. The man knew what I would face at home. "How you get in?" he asked. "I'll find a way to get in." In moments, I was standing at the front door, peering up at the bedroom window directly above it. The house was entirely dark. I knew if I awakened Cyrus, I was dead. In a shrill, hoarse whisper, I roused my mother. "Mom! Mom!" I sighed with relief when she slipped silently into view in the window. She understood immediately and calmly signaled for me to be quiet. Then she disappeared, and in a minute she had pushed the front door open to me. Stealthily, I sneaked up to the bed. For once, I'd gotten away with something under Cyrus's nose. But all the pressures finally took their toll, and I began to be dogged by horrible nightmares. Two predominant themes recurred night after night, and I was powerless to stop them. In one ghastly sequence, I was being sucked into a swirling black tunnel. Someone I could never see was waiting at the end of the tunnel to crush the life out of me. I clawed and screamed and tried to hang on, avoiding the end at all costs, until I awoke quaking with fear, afraid to go back to sleep and the possibility of facing the tunnel again. On other nights, I found myself floating helplessly down a river. Stretched across the width of the river was a long rope, with a ghoulish tangled knot in the middle of it. The knot was alive, seething and breathing anxiously for me to be drawn into it, so it could destroy me. Sometimes lions chased me. Other times I simply ran and ran and ran to escape an unknown predator. Again and again I awoke screaming or laying screaming in my sleep. My mother tried to soothe me and shush me to keep Cyrus from exploding in the next room. My mother needed relief as much as I did. Often Cyrus took perverse delight in sitting across the kitchen table from her, cursing at her and calling her ugly names. Threatening to beat her, she got up and left the room. Sometimes she sat for hours at a time, through the night absorbing the abuse, tears angrily refusing to spill down even though her heart was aching. She had to steal money out of his pants pocket at night to buy groceries. He had made her a wench, forcing her to grovel. There was a spring when Cyrus was especially violent, when Mum was especially fragile, when the summer sun began taking Ontario especially early and life became a sweltering pressure cooker. Mum knew I might not last the summer. She never said anything about it, but she looked at me and looked at Cyrus and knew instinctively that it would be a terrible season for all of us. When she told me she was shipping me off for the summer to Lude and Salma's farm down toward Toronto, the hysterical silent screaming began inside me and continued unceasingly. I was aghast at the thought of leaving my home, the gruesome household that was the only source of my semblance of security that I had ever known. Why would she do this to me? My unposed questions cried out, shrill and relentless, as I watched her pack my hopeless little wardrobe into a cardboard box and prepare me for the trip. And I knew, as if I could look clearly into the future, that my nightmares were about to become a reality.